Speak to the Human is a podcast that explores how we build connections with people in their professional work. It's about the human experience at work and about how to foster that connection and belonging to support people and their organisations to flourish. I'm your host, Sarah Abramson, and I'm looking forward to you joining me in hearing from our brilliant guests. In this episode of Speak to the Human, I'm chatting about one of my favourite subjects with someone who really understands it inside out. Anthony Tasgal, known as Taz, is a storytelling expert. He's an author of multiple books on storytelling and communications, a brand and comms strategist and lecturer, and a speaker at international events. I got to know Taz when I invited him to be our keynote speaker at the first in-person Speak to the Human event in Cambridge in 2022. And all of us there found his insights into the power of storytelling and behavioural economics really compelling. In this conversation, we explore why stories are innately vital to how we think as humans and how they can be used for better communication within organisations. And Taz shares some tips for how to get started using storytelling techniques in simple ways to enhance ordinary ways we all communicate at work. I hope you enjoy listening, and as always, please do drop me a line with your thoughts, feedback, and suggestions for future guests. Hello, Taz. Thanks for joining me on the podcast today. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Sarah. I'm just for everyone's benefit, I'm slightly jet lagged. So if my answers are a little bit delayed, that's probably why.
Jet lagged and with built-in delay.
Built-in delay, that's how I like to think of myself, yes.
Excellent. Well, we'll cut you plenty of slack, so don't worry about it. Let's start by asking you, please, to give our listeners a bit of background about yourself.
Yeah, so I started off working in ad agencies as what's called an account planner strategist. So spent a lot of time doing presentations, watching presentations, working with brands, doing communication, and got interested in a couple of topics. One was storytelling. When I realised how most presentations and most brands were so unbearably dull. And before that, as an academic, I was a classicist, and I still think of myself as a lapsed classicist. So I spent a lot of time with Homer and Virgil, and thought, actually, these are great stories, and human beings use stories to connect. So, why don't we use that in our presentation? So I worked in the ad industry for quite a while, got bored with the fact that the answer to every question was a 40-second television commercial, and wanted to do training and wanted to do some writing, all sorts of other things. So struck out on my own, and I now, do a mixture of training, lecturing, speaking at events, writing, and stuff that I just find interesting.
Brilliant. So, I mean, you've told us a little bit about that interest in storytelling, but what do you think it is about stories that's really sparked your imagination and that connection for you personally?
Yeah, well, it came, at the risk of, going through my own backstory. As I say, I was convinced, as was everyone who knew me, that I would be spending most of my life in a sort of dusty attic in Oxford, translating Virgil into English, and then found myself working in the ad industry, as I said. But I'd never lost my love of stories. And I also thought, isn't it amazing how, cultures around the world, religions, faiths, whatever, we all have stories that we use to understand the world, to compartmentalise the world, to understand who we are, where we fit in. So I'd always had that in the background and never lost it. And then, as I said, once I started working with brands and clients, and enduring intolerably dull presentations, I just thought, maybe there's a way of blending all these things together.
Yeah.
Then the other thing that happened was I got interested in behavioural economics and the power of emotions. So all that sort of got into the sort of blender, the System 1 unconscious blender. And I thought, well, maybe I can just bring some of this to bear and just change the way we talk about presentations or pitches or speeches or brands. And that sort of led me on the path that I'm on, really.
What do you think it is in human nature that makes stories so powerful? Because, absolutely agree, undoubtedly, there is something different that connects with us. But what is that? How would you express it?
I think I used to sort of say it was just sort of baked into our humanity. And as I've got more interested in neuroscience and behavioural economics, I've realised that it's partly cultural, because, as I said, all cultures tell stories. stories are universal. The same cannot be said, however, for PowerPoint or Excel. But the fact is that it's actually part of our chemistry. It's part of our brain. There are mirror neurons which get switched on if you're listening to a story or you're telling a story. And also, sort of plug, shameless plug, I did a TEDx last year talk, and they asked me to talk about some science. And there's a huge amount of science that, for example, links storytelling with a raised level of oxytocin in the blood. And oxytocin is sometimes known as love molecule or the hug molecule because it creates human warmth and empathy. So again, it isn't just some sort of weird, fluffy topic beloved of people with stubble in Shoreditch. It seems to be part of what makes us human. So in a sense, I feel I'm not really pushing something uphill like Sisyphus. I'm sort of dealing with actually or working with the way that the brain works rather than how we often do sort of communications, which I think is working against the brain.
That's so interesting because it's kind of multi-tiered, isn't it? We've got the kind of chemical level of what's actually happening. We're making those connections, but I guess there's a purpose of storytelling that is shared imagination and shared memory as well, back to the kind of oral tradition. But even now, when we have so many different ways of recording information and communicating it, there's something about it that helps us to remember stuff when we need it in a way that's much more, I think, powerful than many other forms of communication.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of getting too heavy too quickly, because I can go the whole spectrum, Sarah, from the trivial to the. One of the things that I'll say about stories, and I ask people in my training or speaking, think about who you are as a person. You know, what are you? What is your self? What is your identity if it's not the sum of the stories that you tell about yourself and that other people tell about you? And as I say, I'm not going to apologise for being too heavy, but I think that is a very interesting way of looking at human beings. So our brain is constantly searching for new stories that reflect who we are or who we want to be. And our brain is carefully sort of frittering away old stories that no longer fit us. So our brain is on a constant search for stories, which is, again, why I'm so interested in it, because it's as I say, what our brain is sort of naturally doing. So whether you're doing a speech at a conference or, talking to people or training, it is those stories and anecdotes that create emotions and create memories. So there's a perfect sort of Venn diagram for me, which has those three words in it: story, emotion, and memory. They all play together.
Brilliant. And I really like that, because I think there's that element of exploring our own identity and how we connect ourselves to the world and having our own story that's very personal to us, that makes sense in our head. Whether or not we've articulated it is part of our own self-perception, isn't it? The way that we see ourselves in the world. But it's also making sense of the information that's coming into us from the outside. How does the world hang together for us? How do we explore our way through it and make sense of what we're seeing every day? And, that's what we see on the news. It's all stories. But also, how do we relate and communicate to other people, other humans that are doing the same thing? It's all stories, isn't it?
It is. And in a funny sort of way, I keep thinking, why do I need to do this?
Is it not?
And your thing is called Speak to the Human. I spoke at your conference a couple of years ago. It was one of the big themes in the conference in New York last week about we've got to be more human. And there's a bit of me that looks at this, I suppose, like the Emperor's New Clothes, and thinks, really? Do we have to say this, that we are human beings? Now, okay, we've got a huge amount of basically fear about AI, so I get that. And there's always been things that human beings fear. But we have got to just remind ourselves that whether it's AI or call centres or robotics, whatever, that humanity is the thing that we share, and storytelling is the default. I don't want to use software because it uses another computer image, but it is the way that our brain perceives the world, as we said. So actually, the more that we do that, the more we're likely, I think, to sort of connect with other people, which is very important. But B, we can actually create that sort of emotional connection, which is so important, not just in communication.
And I know you've talked about this, and it's in your books as well, but I think that you're good at understanding that there isn't a separation between what you're talking about with the quantitative side of the world, the technology, the numbers, the data, all of that stuff that permeates everything that we do. There isn't a separation from that and our innate need to tell stories. In fact, actually, we can make sense of the quantitative side through using this part of how our brain functions. Is that how would you explain that? What do you see happening there?
Yeah, it's one of the sort of key things. Almost like my signature dish is the golden thread, and it goes back again to my classical background, Theseus and the Minotaur and the labyrinth, and Ariadne gives Theseus a golden thread so he can find his way into the labyrinth, and then after he's slain, because that's what it did in those days, slain the Minotaur, he can find his way out. So whether it's quantitative or qualitative, and I do an awful lot of work with research companies who are, and forgive me for saying this, research people, but there is a tendency, let's say, in fact, there's a quote that I often use now from a client of mine when I ask them to do some homework. And they said, we have a tendency to tell everyone everything. And I thought, yeah, that is the problem. But for me, storytelling is, going back to what we said a couple of minutes ago, it's a way of ordering. So when I work with clients on their speeches, on their documents, whatever, one of the key things I'll say is, okay, you can't tell everyone everything, so don't try. And we know what will happen, which is, you'll bore your audience into submission. So you find a thread, you find an argument, you find a hypothesis. Philip Pullman has a lovely expression, Philip Pullman of his Dark Materials fame. Yeah. Everyone hasn't read it, or 5 books now, or watched the series on BBC, please do. He says it's the storyteller's responsibility or role to give the reader a path through the woods. And I love that expression for a number of reasons. Firstly, because so many stories are set, especially fairy tales, in woods. There's a very deep sort of reason for that. But also, it's a nice metaphor like the golden thread. So for me, that's one of the practical ways. So whether you've got a 50-slide quantitative deck about usage and attitude, or whether you've just done some focus groups, or whether you're giving a speech, the first thing you have to do is avoid just telling everyone everything. Find a thread, find an argument, storyboard it, and then try and take out as much that isn't relevant to that thread. And yes, it's hard, and it's about editing, and that's what journalists do. But for me, that's the way, again, of just, as I keep saying, working with the brain rather than against it by, as I say, beating into submission.
That's great. I'd like to come back to that about how stories are used in organisations. But first, it's just, I'd love to explore that a little bit more, about that kind of, I don't know, that sort of deliciously magical side of stories, the going into the woods, the stuff that we connect with from very first childhood memories of hearing stories, even if they're not verbal, the picture books and everything that's magical about books from the youngest age and how they stay with us. What do you think it is that makes a good story? Big question.
Yeah, I have a chart with, I think, 16 boxes on to answer that question, Sarah, which, don't worry, I will not bore you with now.
It might not work so well talking through it in audio.
No, it doesn't mean audio. Just please come along to my training. I'll just say a shameless plug. But one of the things that we talk an awful lot about, there's a couple of things. One is, I haven't given you any etymology yet, which is very unusual for me because I'm obsessed with origins of words. And we've had 13 minutes, and I feel very bad that I haven't done it yet. So I normally talk about the word authority. So again, going back to Aristotle said there are 3 areas of persuasion. And by the way, a lot of what I do, I call it storytelling. Technically, it's rhetoric. But I realised many years ago that if I tell people I'm going to talk about rhetoric, no one would come.
They'd left the room, yeah.
I call it storytelling. So he talks about ethos, logos, and pathos. Those are the 3 elements. So logos is words, facts, information, which we don't have a problem with. Pathos is feelings, as in empathy, sympathy, pathological. Passion is the Latin equivalent of that word. But ethos, he says, and the best translation, the modern translation, I suppose, is somewhere between credibility and authority. And I love the word authority because we've forgotten the word that's in the word authority. It's the word author. So again, going back to our earlier point about the power of story, it's because we give authority and status to people that tell us stories. So going back to what I think the first sort of question you said a second ago, One of the key things, but the other bit of etymology is the word character. So we have characters in stories. And again, because the etymology, another etymological digression, the word character in Greek means a stamp, as in something is stamped on, which is literally what a brand is, like a branding iron. So the word has the same meaning. But in a story, obviously a character is a person. They have goals, hopes, obstacles, fears. So for me, one of the key things that when I'm working with clients on whatever it is, if it's their internal comms, their external comms, speeches, etc., is to try and actually make it about people and characters. And again, one of the exercises I get people do is about creating conflict, because you can't have a story without conflict. And often clients will say to me, "Oh yeah, we have stories on our website," and I'll look at them and I'll say they're not stories; they're case studies. Somebody came to us, we did this, it was brilliant. The end. That's not. You need a conflict, because once you have a conflict between hero, villain, good and bad, the brain is invested in that conflict. And again, one of the key elements of storytelling is empathy. And I'll wait in a minute, and maybe we'll come back to empathy later, because it's a massive topic, by itself. But those are a couple of areas that I would say in terms of using and deploying storytelling.
That's great. And do you think stories always have to have a kind of story arc where there's the characters kind of going on a journey and overcoming something? And does it always work that way, or is it?
It'll depend very much on the client, the context. As you say, there are, going back to Christian Vogler, going back to Murray, going back to all sorts of people have talked about, the nature of the arc. And you can do it that. You can talk about various brands. So you can talk about the guy who basically created Nike by looking at his wife's waffle iron. And you can talk about, again, a problem he had the insight, etc. It doesn't always have to be that. And what I try and do with people is to say there are loads of different tools available. So the story arc is one, conflict is another, headlining, actually trying to create a headline for your story. There are all sorts of different avenues that story opens up. So my goal is always to say it's a very rich sort of cornucopia, a thesaurus, if you like, of ways of thinking. And depending on who your audience is, how much desire there is for this, what channel or medium you're using, some of these will be more available to you to use, and some will be perhaps less.
So yeah, let's pick that up with that kind of application into an organisational context. I mean, it'd be great to have some concrete examples of how organisations might use stories, but I suppose first, why do you think they should be thinking more about this?
I think to some extent it reflects what you were saying before, which is there is this tendency, and again, I haven't managed to go this far without using the word jargon, I think, which is quite unusual. There is a tendency for clients and companies to get buried, or actually to bury themselves, really, in very technical jargon. And I've worked with BBC, Panasonic, Nokia, Mauser, Royal Albert Hall, all sorts of different clients in very, very different markets. And yet, they all manage to find ways of burying what they do, burying the human side of what they do, in very often bland and nonsensical jargon. So a lot of it, the first stage, and it's in the books and in my training, the first stage is really, it's like, going to Alcoholics Anonymous. First thing you have to do is realise you have a problem. So a lot of it is saying, okay, let's try and rid ourselves, what I call junk the jargon. Let's try and get rid of as much of that, because you can't make a story if you're buried, knee deep in jargon. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, okay, what have you got that has real people? Whether it's the person that created the company, so whether it's Steve Jobs at Apple or Branson or whatever. I talk about them in fact, the last book as well. If you've got a foundation story or a foundation myth or a creation story, that's great. And use it, because people can, again, empathise with what that person was trying to achieve. Even if you haven't got that, you've probably got real examples of what it's done for people. So again, don't just talk about the technology of what you produce. What does it mean for people? Does it make their lives easier? Does it give them opportunities to do other things? So it's always about looking at the sort of end-to-end human benefit at the most personal sort of way. And it can be, as I said before, any type of application that I've mentioned. But it's really about getting those stages set first. Because, as I say, if you don't, everything is going to be built on the platform of, meaninglessness.
Yeah, so I suppose there's a kind of grand scale to organisational stories, like the origin story and the company culture and those big picture things, that if those have been well told, I guess it's easier for other people in the company to pick them up and to relate to them if they have
Yes.
the skills and the thinking to do that. What if that doesn't exist and you are, I don't know, a manager in a large organisation and you want to use storytelling? How might you go about that in a sort of slightly smaller scale way for your own purposes?
No, it's a really good question. And of all the different sort of gigs that I do, one of the more common gigs, so some of it is external comms, some of it is internal comms, but occasionally I do get that, which is, I really want to sort of create a culture. I want to, I don't extend my leadership skills, whatever it might be. And I feel that the story can help me, but I don't know how. So again, part of it is about trying to identify that sort of internal corporate culture, brand culture, personal culture, whatever, but finding a way of expressing it. Because again, often see organisations, and even before when I was working in ad agencies, and now I'll go to companies or bits of government, whatever, and they've got their values, and everyone knows that actually those words are just meaningless. Again, as I said, they sort of don't stand for anything, and they're all the same anyway. So part of it is finding ways, and often it's language, because again, one of the things that I'm fascinated, as you can tell, is just language. So part of it is saying to people, especially in that sort of internal leadership sort of space, try and use language which is much more human and much more creative. For example, one of my big areas, which again we may or may not have time to cover, Sarah, is humour.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So book 5 was called the Insight book, which is reasonably self-descriptive. And again, what I was talking about in New York is what is an insight? How do you come up with insights? And I'm fascinated by the overlap between insight and humour. So for me, insight is like a punchline. So 2 fish in a tank, one says to the other, "How do you drive this thing?" Good, live laughter. So again, if anyone wants a Greek word, actually whether you want it or not, it's called paraprosdokian, and it literally means going in an unexpected direction. So for me, insight and humour do exactly the same job.
Right.
But the point is, and I have a little sort of section called, Why So Serious, which is for Batman and Joker fans out there. Because often I think in our comms, it's very serious and very grown up, and therefore actually very dull. Now, I'm not saying this is right for every brand or every leader or whatever, but I do encourage people just to look at being more playful and humorous and witty. Because if you think about some of the things that unite us as human beings, some of the great brands like Apple or Specsavers or whatever, they do use humour.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not saying it's a blanket answer to everything. But I think, again, that is something that I encourage leaders to do because, again, it creates that word that I've talked about before, empathy. Humour is all about creating empathy. If people laugh with you, they're relating to what you're saying. So for me, again, that's a really underappreciated human characteristic which works in so many different areas.
That's brilliant. Do you think that there are elements of corporate sort of organisational structure and leadership where there's just a degree of caution about being able to do that constrains use of that? How do you see that manifesting, and are there ways to work with it, around it?
You're absolutely right, Sarah. And I'm always at pains to say to people, this is not right for everyone or every context or every brand, every situation. I won't force people to, tell jokes or even necessarily to use stories. It really depends on what's right for, as I say, that company and that person. But my point is, I think if we can wean ourselves off this rather sort of aloof, cold, informal, clinical way of talking, and I don't know if hopefully no one listening or you have a partner who works in management consultancy.
Nope.
I think I blame management consultants largely everything. Because what they do is they create all this language, and people go, "Oh, that sounds really," and then when you realise there's nothing there. So again, going back to what I said about jargon, really, it is trying to just say if we can, as I say, wean ourselves off this. And as with all these things, there's a spectrum. And if you try a little bit of this sort of more human, more humorous approach, fine. If you want to go further down that spectrum, fine. It's really up to, as I say, what you feel is right. Because as somebody that's worked in marketing and advertising for centuries, the first rule is always understand your target audience.
Yeah.
So I would never foist that, upon. And I've worked with clients and organisations where you can just tell that is just so ingrained in their culture that you can't. But I'm always trying at least to say, just see what it feels like to try a different type of language.
Well, and I think that whatever those constraints are, whatever the context is, it comes down to emotional connection, doesn't it? So if one way of making an emotional connection doesn't quite work in this context, there needs to be another way. And I couldn't agree more about stepping away, having the courage to step away from either being too safe or where it's just not going to get listened to, or being too corporate or whatever sounds kind of grown up and I know what I'm doing and kind of I'm here demonstrating my credibility. It's just like, actually, this isn't interesting. What are the connections that we can make so that people get it and they're excited and they want to be part of whatever story you are telling? So I think I love what you're saying about humour. Couldn't agree more. I think it's fantastic. But there are other ways of making that emotional connection. Can you talk about some of those other ingredients? And related to that, are stories more effective perhaps in a sort of internal, I don't know, presentation, for example, if you can bring a personal element to it? And does that work? Do you see that working well?
Okay, let me address the first part of that question because firstly, it allows me to talk about my new book.
Setting you up beautifully there, yeah.
Beautifully set up, yeah, on a plate. So, the new book is called The Consumer Behaviour Book, and it is my take on behavioural economics. And you've mentioned the word emotion, and for me, that is the springboard for all of this. And we've talked a little bit about it. But if I can just sort of link it to what you were saying, behavioural economics tells us a number of things. The main one is that we like to think that we are in control of what we do and we're in control of our decisions. And spoiler alert, we're largely not. And there's a great quote from a neuroscientist called David Eagleman who says, "We don't think the way we think," which I always feel should be followed by a round of applause because it's such a beautiful way of saying we like to think we're rational and logical and independent, but let's be honest, we're not. So we are far more affected by our emotions. And I think what you just said, Sarah, is interesting because I think no one really knows, but a lot of people would argue that the most important emotion is fear, actually. I was just over in the States and we were talking about, the political situation. And if you think about any political situation anywhere, fear is never too far away. And I don't want to get into the B word because I've had quite a few years off talking about Brexit. So my therapist wouldn't like me to start again. But fear is incredibly important. But the way that you talked about it, Sarah, is important because an awful lot of companies are driven by fear. They're driven by, if we do try something new, it's a risk, we might fail, So part of all of this, about storytelling, about applying emotions, about looking for insight, is by saying if you're driven by fear, that's probably a recipe for doing the opposite of anything new or exciting. So you've got to understand a way of trying to set your fear aside. And again, if you just look at what are considered to be the big six emotions, which we see on facial expressions: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, disgust. If you don't want to follow that up, you can just watch Inside Out. Yeah. I often use that as a way of just getting clients to play with emotions and say, okay, whatever you're working on, if it's a new product or a website or an internal piece of internal comms or a speech, just for a minute, don't worry about what you're saying. Just think about what emotions you're trying to evoke. And that leads me really nicely to what's the best way of evoking emotions? Oh, it's through stories. So for me, it's a nice way in which they all sort of play together. And going back to the second half of your question, I think especially with internal sort of communications or any form of internal sort of dialogue, again, I think it's just much easier if we're open and transparent and honest about emotions, about whether it's, I don't know, the people that we work with or the relationship we have with our clients. I just think it's going to be a much more effective outcome if we don't try to obscure these things with jargon or evasive language, but actually just be honest. So again, because I come from a background of creating or working with creative people and showing ads to clients, we have to be honest and say, okay, this is why I don't like it, or this is why we think it. And rather than, again, just avoiding what is emotionally honest, because that leads to all sorts of chaos.
Do you think this is something we need to practice? Because it feels like sometimes that's not going to come easily to people. And do we need to try and lean into it a bit, help ourselves to get more comfortable with that?
Yeah, and again, I often find myself, and I sometimes say this when I'm doing training or consultancy with clients, is a lot of the time I'm being brought in to sort of give people permission. I'm not really there to teach them stuff, or sort of am a bit about behavioural economics or storytelling or insight, but give people permission to express themselves. Because often I find, and okay, I know I come from a creative background, so creative people, that's their job. But what always annoyed me about working in the ad industry was there were people who were called creative. So by definition, everyone else who wasn't creative wasn't creative. And I always found that slightly annoying. So I think a lot of what I'm trying to do is to say to people, I'm here because we're trying to give you permission. We're giving you legitimacy to think outside the box, or to be creative, or to, again, put your emotions into things. So I think once I do that, and if I've got permission, from the top, I can say to people, don't worry, in this workshop, in this whatever we do, you can be as open and questioning and curious as you want to be, because that's why I'm here. And I find that generally, and again, there's a spectrum here, obviously, but generally, most people will open up and become more creative and more curious, and that usually leads, I think, to more sort of worthwhile outcomes.
I think in my mind as well, related to that, is that you don't have to be excellent at this. There's going to be those people like you who are experienced writers and have always kind of grown up telling stories and thinking about it and really engaged with that side of things. But there are many people where they wouldn't categorize themselves as a storyteller if it's kind of related in their mind to being, like you say, a creative type. They're like, oh no, that's not me. I'm going to stick with my safe way of doing this presentation or whatever it is. But actually, we don't have to be outstanding as storytellers in order to use some of these techniques to make something land better, more memorable, more engaging, for people to have some kind of connection with it. I think.
Yeah.
Is this fair? And do you see this happening? It's just about practicing some of those ways of doing it and getting in the habit of thinking about it. Even if it's just a little bit, it's going to be a little bit better than it would be if you were not doing it at all.
Absolutely. I don't want to be sort of, generalise and be rude to everyone. But I think the bar is relatively low. Because I often say to people, how many presentations do you think that I've either witnessed or created myself? And if anyone's listening, and maybe Sarah, we can send them a book. The person, if someone writes either to you or to me on LinkedIn or my email, the person who gets nearest, we'll send them a copy of the book.
Nice. Excellent.
It's a big number, I'll tell you. And most of them are completely unmemorable, and I've forgotten them. But there's a few that I do remember. And it is, I think, because they do the things that we've talked about. They're emotional, they have something that leaves a dent in the memory. And again, going back to the other point, this isn't for everyone. I mean, as I said, there is a spectrum. And I've developed rather bizarrely, for a classicist, a segmentation based on marine biology. So hold on tight.
I am.
Over the years, I've come to the conclusion that there's a sort of 3-part segmentation to people. So one group are sponges, and they absorb all of this, and they run with it, and they love it. And obviously, you want a lot of sponges in your training or in your group or in your company. The second group are clams, and they will clam up, and they will pretty much not want to play. And again, even when you're doing focus groups, there's always somebody who is a clam. And generally, you can talk to them, but they need special treatment. And frankly, you may just have to say, right, this is not for you. And my third group, my third segment, are seaweed, who basically sort of float along. So my job is often to turn the seaweed into sponges, because if they're interested and they're engaged, they will lap it up. So that tends to be the segmentation. And I've used this for a couple of companies actually when they say, well, HR, can you tell me what was the group like? And I'll say it was like, 7-3-1. So we had like 7 sponges, 3 seaweed, and a clam. It sounds like a menu, doesn't it?
Yeah, a little bit.
But I do think that's one way of just accepting that, firstly, that, people will just respond differently. But also to see the sponge is right, I've got you there, that's sorted. The seaweed, okay, what is it that's going to make you become, more like a sponge? And with the clam, what is it that I can perhaps get them to break out? And sometimes they are the data analysts, the data squirrels, but not always. Because sometimes the data people I work with are desperate to tell stories and are really good at telling stories. And conversely, sometimes the people who think they're really creative can be really rubbish when it comes to actually, telling a story. It becomes all about them or whatever. So I've learned never necessarily to expect people to fit where I think they're going to fit. But as I say, as a sort of general way of applying that, it's actually been quite useful.
It's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And I love how you've sneaked in a sort of storytelling way of thinking about the groups that you're working with.
Did you spot that?
It's very, very memorable analogy, isn't it? I really like that. So I guess have you got tips for helping people who are listening to this and don't have the benefit of you being there in person in a workshop or whatever? Have you got tips for how they might start to use storytelling in their work?
Yeah, I think really sort of going back to what I said before, my first thing is I have an expression which I will throw again at your listeners, Sarah, which is, again, talking about insight in the book. I'm a big fan of serendipity because that's how insights generally occur. If you look at great scientists, creative people, thinkers, it's often known as the 3 Bs, bed, bath, and bus. So you go to bed, you can't think of a problem to resolve, you have to resolve the problem. You wake up in the morning, suddenly eureka, or you're having a bath like Archimedes did. So this is just one example that happened to me of serendipity, which was I was writing a speech for a client, and I was talking about the brain, I was talking about attention span. And anyone who's listening, if you look at your keyboard, you'll see the letter N and M are next to each other. So I accidentally typed attention spam with an M. And I thought, oh, that's that. Yeah, I quite like that. So that's now become my shorthand. Always good. Natural laughter is always good. It's become my shorthand for any communication task you have. Your first goal is to avoid going into your audience's attention spam. Because we like to think that everything we say goes from my attention inbox, if you like, into your attention inbox. But again, we know neuroscientists tell us that 80-90% will go into attention spam. So my first tip is always, whatever you are doing, even before we started thinking about story, how are you going to stop what you are saying or writing going into your audience's attention spam? So take stuff out, take the jargon out, take out 90% of the numbers, take out 90% of the bullet points, because that will help you. That's always my first sort of guide, really. The second thing I mentioned of the golden thread, which is try and think about hypotheses and arguments. And again, especially when I'm working with quantitative researchers who've just got a mass of data, massive charts. As I said, you can't show everything to everyone, so at least give your audience an argument. Give them a what if. What if you were to try this? What if you were to, reduce your price? Or what if you were to talk to a completely different audience? Or what if you renamed your brand? And then use that as a frame for your presentation or your argument or your data. And yes, you can have more than one thread. That's fine. But what you don't do, as I say, is just throw everything. Because somebody once, as an ancient historian, someone once said about history is just one damn fact after another. And again, too often our presentations, especially not just quantitative people, it is just one damn bit of data or one damn bullet point after another. So it's about finding. So again, I'll use this as a tip. Just write down what if. So when you're writing your debrief or your speech, what if we thought about this? What if we completely reframed? And then use that as your framework and then see what data or what evidence fits that thread. Be ruthless about taking out everything that doesn't, and then see what that gives you. And I find that a useful sort of way of giving people something to start with.
I really like that. I'm going to go away and try and apply that to whatever next situation is where I mean, it's all the time, isn't it? Actually, we need to tell stories all the time.
It is. I mean, I have a whole section, again, as a film. Don't mention I'm a huge film buff. So where I live in North London, I was a trustee of a cinema a mile up there called the Phoenix, the oldest continually running cinema in the country. So I'll say to people, think about how many books, plays, films are what ifs. So my favourite example I'll ask you now, Sarah, is what if you woke up every day and it was the same day?
Oh, well, it's Groundhog Day, isn't it?
What if you woke up every day and it was the same day?
Yeah, you can torture me now.
So whether it's Animal Farm or The Handmaid's Tale, great stories are what ifs, science fiction, fact. So again, if you cast what you're saying as a what if, it automatically plugs into that storytelling part of the brain.
That is brilliant. I love it. So much to explore there, isn't there? I mean, it's just fascinating. It's endlessly fascinating because for all the reasons that we talked about at the start, it's innately human and fascinating to us. Thank you. I'm going to wrap things up with a final question that I ask all our guests, with this being Speak to the Human podcast. Speaking to you, Taz, as a human.
Yes.
What's exciting you at the moment? What are you looking forward to? And what's motivating you, either in your work or in anything else?
Well, I find myself at the last sort of 10 years, having written 6 books, I'm either writing a book, editing a book, or promoting a book. So at the moment, I seem to be doing all of those because the consumer behaviour book is out. The insight book is still in Smith's at the big airports. And for any stray classicists listening, the next book is going to be the classical marketing book. What did the Greeks and Romans ever teach us about marketing?
I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, I mentioned it to a few people, and a lot of people seem to like it, apart from my family, who think I'm mad. So it's about mythology. How can we use Greek myths to understand, different typologies and segments? So, are your audience more like Dionysus or Apollo, for example, or Sisyphus or Odysseus? A bit about vocabulary, because I'm obsessed with words and etymology, and also about persuasion, which is, again, rhetoric and some of the storytelling. So that's one of my main things. The other thing is I'm continuing my interest in humour. So I have now dabbled in a bit of stand-up.
Really?
Yeah. I have written in the past, but I did a course a few months ago, and we've done a couple of gigs. And I'm writing some more stuff, some new stuff. So, that's also on the plate.
Intriguing.
And it is intriguing, and it's by far the most terrifying thing I've ever done.
I'm sure we've been talking about scary stuff, but this is that's another level of scary.
Yeah, it's really good, and it's great. It was great fun. There were 10 of us doing it, and I did 2 nights and escaped unscathed. And I didn't humiliate my children, which was the main goal.
Which is hard, just going out about your everyday business. I think. Never mind being on stage trying to be a comedian. So, congratulations.
Yeah, I don't know how much more. I want to do a little bit more, but I'll see, because I'm not quite sure what level I'll stop at. But it's been a great experience, and again, because I'm interested in humour anyway, the study of humour, it's been quite interesting looking at it, if you like, as a practitioner as well. So. Yeah, that's all happening. So that will keep me busy for a bit.
Oh, fantastic. Definitely. And this has been great. If our listeners would like to find out more about the work that you're doing, we'll share some links in the show notes. But where can people find you? What's a good way of finding your...
I seem to sort of mainly make do with LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. So I'm Tasgal with lots of S's in there, Tasgal on LinkedIn. Again, just look at Amazon, or other sites are available for the books. I know, as I said, at least one or two of them are in some of the bigger Smiths at the airports as well, if you want a physical copy. Yeah, I think that's mainly it, really.
Brilliant. And they're lovely books, actually. They're really they're quite tactile, aren't they?
Yes, a couple of them were bigger ones, but 4 of the 6 are what are called the concise advice. So they're like moleskin size.
Yeah.
So you can read them. The idea is you can read them like on a long train journey or a plane flight or something. So yeah, please do.
Perfect. I've so enjoyed this conversation. I mean, I am absolutely avid story lover from day one of me. So it's just wonderful to explore these ideas, like dig into what that's about and, how we might use it really, really effectively.
And if anyone's interested, again, if you find me either on LinkedIn, hopefully you'll have my Yahoo email as well. Please do send me your stories, stories that you've liked, or even maybe stories of when you've tried to tell stories, or stories of perhaps when clients haven't got it right.
Story disasters.
Yeah, I mean, I love collecting them because, again, it just for me is just partly just fascinating about seeing how people react to them. So yeah, please by all means do bombard me with your story.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Taz. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Pleasure.
Thank you everyone for listening, and bye for now.